Not here. Not now.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really jumping into some deep water, psychologically speaking. We're looking at this really fundamental choice, one that, well, it shapes pretty much everything lies. Relationships, how we agree on things as groups.
Yeah, it's a big one.
You gave us some sources that just cut right to the core of being human in a social world. Specifically, what happens when that drive we think we have for truth? What happens when it slams up against our need for safety, that comfort zone?
That's exactly it. The main text we're diving into today, Clarity, Sovereignty, and the Comfort of Illusion, it really explores how we handle truth, how we perceive it. And it's challenging, because it pushes back hard against this common idea that humans are all about seeking truth above all else.
Right.
This material suggests, well, something a lot more complex, maybe something a bit more uncomfortable about what we really prioritize.
Okay, so let's unpack that. A heavy premise for sure. Our mission today, then, is to try and figure out why people might actively, turn away from a clear view of reality. Why choose peace over insight? What's the actual psychological price tag for holding on to those illusions we love? And then, what does it even mean to reach what the source calls psychological adulthood or sovereignty?
And we have to start with that really provocative claim, the one that sets the whole stage. The sources argue pretty directly that most people aren't genuinely searching for truth. They're searching for comfort. And this isn't presented as, cynicism. It's framed as a fundamental psychological defense mechanism, protective.
Wow, okay. That changes the game right away, doesn't it? It shifts it from being purely intellectual, seeking facts, to being deeply psychological.
Yeah.
Because if my main drive isn't objective reality, but a comfortable version of it, then everything, every conversation, every bit of news, every challenge gets filtered through this lens of, psychological self-defense.
Exactly. It's like an internal algorithm constantly asking, is this information going to stabilize me or is it going to shake things up?
Right. Shake my sense of self.
Precisely. And the source argues that for most people, instinctively, the answer always leans towards stability. We're wired for survival, right?
Yeah.
And psychological stability feels an awful lot like survival.
Makes sense. We stick with what feels safe.
So, yeah, that's the setup.
Okay, so let's dig into that preference for illusion then. The mechanics of it. Why do we want this objective version of reality, the one that keeps us stable instead of, reality itself? The source points to three core reasons, three protective functions these comfortable stories serve.
And these three are really tangled up with our identity. We're not talking small white lies here. We're talking about structural supports holding up the self.
Okay.
The first, and maybe the most crucial one, is the drive to preserve their identity.
Identity. Okay. How does the source connect our self-image with pushing truth away?
Well, think about it. Your identity, fundamentally, it's a story, isn't it? It's this narrative you're constantly spinning to yourself and to others about who you are, what you're worth, why you do what you do.
Like a personal mythology.
Kind of, yeah. So maybe you see yourself as always generous. Or maybe you're the perpetual victim in your story, or the scrappy underdog who always fights back.
Right, we have these roles.
Exactly. Now, imagine some clear, objective truth pops up that just completely contradicts that core narrative. Maybe it shows your generosity isn't so selfless. Maybe it's actually transactional.
Ouch.
Or maybe your victimhood is actually, sustained by choices you're making. If that truth gets in, the whole narrative can just collapse.
And that collapse sounds
Okay.
really bad. Psychologically catastrophic, you called it?
It is. It's not just realizing you got a fact wrong. It's realizing the main character in your life story, you might be fundamentally different than you thought.
Yeah, that's destabilizing.
Hugely. And our psychological system is actually really good at preventing that collapse. It gets very efficient. So protecting that core story and the identity built on it means you have to actively filter stuff out. Any data that suggests another way of seeing things, filtered. The illusion is like this protective layer, this varnish over a potentially fragile sense of self.
Okay, that makes sense. And that connects to the second reason, right? Which is protecting emotional narratives. This sounds similar, but more about feelings, like the stories we tell ourselves about why we feel a certain way.
Exactly. It's about justifying our emotional states. We build these protective shells, often around past hurts or things we haven't really processed.
Did you give an example? What's an emotional narrative look like?
Sure. Common ones might be something like, I can never succeed because this one traumatic thing happened to me. Or a really common one, all men are X, or all women are Y, usually based on a few bad experiences,
Yeah,
right?
generalizations.
Or even less traumatic stuff, like, oh, I always procrastinate because I'm just fundamentally lazy or undisciplined.
Ah, right. Instead of seeing it as maybe I'm procrastinating because I'm burned out or overwhelmed.
Exactly. That last one is great because it shifts it from a temporary state or a reaction to a fixed character flaw.
Right.
Now imagine if some objective truth suggested that the trauma, while real, wasn't the only thing defining your potential, or that your lack of discipline was actually a pretty rational response to having way too much on your plate.
Um,
To accept that truth, you'd have to let go of the emotional story you've been carrying, maybe for years. That righteous anger, or that validating sadness, or even that, carefully constructed sense of, well, this is just how things are for me.
so giving up the story isn't just about feeling better. It's about facing the situation without that familiar emotional filter. That sounds really vulnerable.
Utterly,
Yeah.
nakedly vulnerable, as you said. The narrative gives the pain a shape, a structure. Without it, the pain might feel random or meaningless. Or maybe even scarier, it might reveal that you actually have some power to change things. And taking that responsibility, that can feel terrifying.
Wow. Okay. Identity protection, emotional narrative protection. What's the third one? You said it was more social.
Yeah, the third is intensely social. It's about the group, the need to maintain social harmony. Basically, we avoid rocking the boat. Not because we're afraid of a debate, necessarily, but because we're afraid of messing with the group's agreed-upon reality.
The collective illusion.
Pretty much. It's like social physics. Truth, especially a clarity about, say, tricky dynamics in a group or contradictions everyone ignores or uncomfortable facts about people, it creates friction. And friction messes up the smooth running of social life.
Like in a family.
Perfect example. Think of a family unit where everyone implicitly agrees that, say, mom is the stable rock and Uncle Joe is the lovable screw-up. That might be a stable structure, comfortable even, but maybe it's built on illusion.
So if someone points out, hey, actually, mom's stability looks a lot like control, or Uncle Joe isn't screwing up, he's clearly struggling with something serious.
Boom, the whole system could fracture.
Right.
So to keep that fragile harmony going, that comfortable, slightly edited version of reality, it has to be enforced.
And anyone who speaks the truth that threatens it?
They get labeled, they're a threat to the peace, a destabilizer, not a truth teller, but a saboteur in the eyes of the group that needs the illusion.
Okay, so these three things, identity, emotion, social harmony, they create this powerful fortress around our comfortable reality. What happens when objective truth tries to get through that armor? The article says accepting truth requires transformation, a dismantling of the self.
Yes, and it's so important to emphasize this isn't just an intellectual challenge, it's existential. Accepting a difficult truth often means admitting you were wrong, maybe profoundly wrong, about who you are, what you believe in, how the world works.
And that realization forces change.
It necessitates change in how you act, who you relate to, how you see yourself. It demands a radical shift.
And that shift, that transformation, the source says our psyche often reads that as a kind of death.
Exactly, a death of the current self, the familiar self. That's why rejecting truth often isn't about simple ignorance. It's not usually that people don't know the facts or haven't seen the evidence.
It's few.
It's a deep-seated, almost primal fear of losing who they think they are. The comfortable illusion is like a psychological life raft. You're floating in this vast, unknown ocean, and the truth is asking you to jump off the raft.
That sounds, well, it sounds quite bleak, almost cynical. Is the source basically saying most people are just fundamentally unwilling to grow if it means facing uncomfortable truths about themselves?
I think it's saying the pain of staying the same, even if it's flawed and comfortable, often feels less threatening than the anxiety of stepping into the unknown, even if that unknown is more truthful. The current self, flaws and all, is familiar territory. It's home base, psychologically.
So giving up the life raft for clarity feels like drowning.
To many, yes, it feels like self-dissolution. So the perceived cost of that transformation, it just feels too high. Psychological self-preservation trumps truth-seeking in most cases. That's the argument.
Okay, that fear of losing the self, the fear of transformation, that leads us right into how we manage our identity, especially socially, how we present ourselves. And this is where the sources bring in some heavy hitters from psychology to explain it, right? The persona, the social mask.
Yes, exactly. This section really bridges that internal drive for comfort with the behaviors we can actually see on the outside. And the author uses two key figures here to frame it. Alan Watts, and Carl Jung.
Okay, let's start with Watts. He talks about this confusion people have between their social persona, the role they play, and their actual true self.
Right. Watts was really insightful about how modern folks, especially in complex societies, build these elaborate roles. The successful professional, the caring parent, the always positive friend.
We craft these images.
We invest so much energy into performing these roles, perfecting the script, getting the costume right, and we get so caught up in the performance, Watts said, that we forget it is just a role, the mask. And the moment we start thinking the mask is the face underneath.
Then the persona becomes who we think we are.
Exactly. It becomes the main identifier. And that can make it incredibly fragile.
So if my persona is, say, the always logical, unemotional decision maker, then any evidence that I'm actually being driven by emotion or acting illogically, that directly threatens the whole performance.
Precisely. And Carl Jung gives us the foundational concept here, the persona. He didn't just see it as a role, but as psychological armor. Necessary even for navigating society. It's the compromise, really, between who we are inside and what the world demands from us outside.
Okay, but is the persona always a problem? You mentioned armor, which sounds protective. Jung distinguished between healthy and unhealthy personas, didn't he?
Absolutely. That's a crucial distinction. A healthy persona is functional. It's flexible. You understand it's a tool, like putting on a uniform for work. You can take it off.
Right.
An unhealthy persona, which is what the source is really zeroing in on here, becomes rigid. Brittle. The person fuses with the mask. They become the job title. They are the moral high ground they claim.
So any threat to the title or the perceived morality.
Feels like total annihilation of the self. Not just losing a role, but like the person is being destroyed. The mask is the reality for them.
Okay, so if I'm operating from behind that kind of brittle armor, that fused persona, what happens when someone comes along and just speaks plainly, tells a truth that challenges the mask's story?
According to the source, it's almost always perceived as an existential threat. Not as helpful insight, not as perspective. It's seen as an attack on the very structure of the self that person has worked so hard to build.
So the reaction isn't intellectual disagreement.
No, it's more like a psychological siege defense. Instinctive, visceral.
That suddenly makes those weirdly aggressive or defensive reactions you sometimes see. It makes them make sense. It's not about the facts being discussed. It's about protecting the psyche.
Exactly. And the source details some specific, very recognizable defensive reactions. And the key is, they're designed to shut down the clarity without actually engaging with the content of the truth being offered.
Okay, like what? What are these reactions?
Well, the first and probably most common is just easy dismissal. Labeling the truth teller. Calling them too serious or too intense or just plain negative.
The you need to lighten up defense.
Precisely. It's a way of pathologizing the messenger. If you can frame them as emotionally flawed or socially awkward or fundamentally cynical,
Then you don't have to deal with their message.
exactly. You neutralize the inconvenient truth they're presenting by making it about their supposed issues. You pathologize their clarity to protect your comfort. It's a neat trick.
Yeah, it shifts the focus entirely. Very clever, in a defensive way.
Very. The second reaction is simpler. Active avoidance. Just staying away from people who tend to point out the contradictions, who see the scaffolding behind the social stage.
Right, if you know someone's likely to say the uncomfortable thing.
You just stop inviting them. Or you keep interactions superficial. They become socially expensive to have around. Their presence threatens the collective comfort, the shared dream state. So the tribe, in a way, self-censors by marginalizing them.
They're seen as a contagion of clarity.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And the third reaction, maybe the most immediate, is internal, physical even. You actually feel yourself becoming tense, uncomfortable, maybe even anxious when someone starts speaking with too much clarity.
The body reacts.
The body physically recoils because the nervous system flags it as danger. The clarity feels like it's dismantling something important.
That physical tension is a real giveaway, isn't it? We don't usually get tense about abstract disagreements. We get tense when our inner stability feels genuinely threatened.
And that's the crucial distinction the source stresses. These reactions are not rational objections. They're not logical counter-arguments. They are powerful, almost involuntary defenses against inner instability.
The tension is the sound of the mask cracking.
Yeah, something like that. And the person is scrambling inside, trying to patch up the psychological armor before they feel exposed, vulnerable. It's the ultimate defense. Face something that forces me to rethink who I am. My first instinct is often to shoot the messenger and rebuild the walls. And this deep, gut-level need to protect the mask, to avoid that inner shaking, It inevitably pushes us into the social world where, well, a really profound and often tragic compromise happens.
Okay.
We basically get forced into a choice: stick to our internal clarity or maintain our external acceptance by the group.
And the sources say there's a clear hierarchy here, a ranking in how humans tend to behave. It suggests that the need for belonging often ranks higher than the need for truth.
Yeah, and similarly, comfort often ranks higher than clarity.
That feels depressingly true sometimes. But why? Why is belonging so powerful?
Well, think about our evolutionary history. For basically all of human existence, being part of the tribe wasn't just nice, it was survival. Getting kicked out, that was a death sentence.
Right. Safety in numbers.
Exactly. And even though we're not hunter-gatherers anymore, that deep primal wiring is still incredibly strong. We crave social validation. And it's not just about feeling liked. As we discussed, that validation confirms the reality of our identity, our persona.
So the group agreeing with my mask makes my mask feel real. It
Yeah.
gives my invented self a kind of collective stamp of approval.
Precisely. The consensus acts like an external mirror, validating the internal illusion. If everyone agrees, yep, that's who you are, the illusion feels solid, safe, real.
But if one person speaks up, offers clarity that contradicts the group's story.
It doesn't just challenge that one person, it potentially undermines the reality for everyone who shares that illusion. And that's why that truth teller often faces what the sources call the isolation tax on truth.
The isolation tax, I like that phrase. It makes the cost really concrete. What does that tax look like in practice? We know it's steep, but what's the actual bill?
Well, it shows up in a few ways, beyond just, not getting invited to parties anymore. The obvious one is the isolation, yes. People find you too sharp, too intense, maybe just too difficult for comfort-focused social circles.
Okay.
But the tax can also hit your career. Clarity can be socially expensive at work. Think about environments where getting ahead often means playing along with certain narratives, maybe, about how great the company is doing or how brilliant the boss is or how harmonious the team is, even when it's not.
So speaking the truth, even constructively, could mean getting subtly sidelined. Passed over for promotions, left out of the loop, maybe not put on key projects because you're seen
As a potential destabilizer.
Yeah.
Yeah. You might be respected, maybe even liked from a distance, but you're deemed unsafe for the inner circle where the real power operates, often relying on those shared, comfortable fictions.
Wow. So you're literally paying for your insight with connection, with opportunity.
Absolutely. Proximity costs honesty, or honesty costs proximity.
That must put enormous pressure on people who naturally start to see things clearly. They face this stark realization: stay in the warmth of the group or start engaging in, well, self-betrayal.
That's exactly it. It's this moment of tragic reckoning, as the source puts it. And the compromise needed to stay in. It's behavioral, and it's insidious because it just chips away at your internal integrity little by little, day by day.
How? What are the behaviors? The force identifies three main ways people adapt to avoid paying the full isolation tax.
Right. The first is learning to self-edit.
You're biting your tongue.
Constantly. It's that moment-to-moment censoring. You feel an insight rising, maybe a difficult question, something that contradicts the group's comfortable story,
Yep.
and you just stop yourself. You change the subject, or you water it down, or you swallow it completely. Maybe cover it with a nervous laugh or an agreeable nod.
So the real observer inside you is always living this kind of muted existence.
Pretty much. Which leads directly to the second technique, learning to lower the voltage of your words.
Lower the voltage. How does that work?
It means maybe you do say the truth, but you say it weakly. You hedge it with caveats. Well, maybe it's possible that. Or you frame it as a hesitant question instead of a clear statement. Could it be that?
So you package the potentially disruptive insight in soft, fuzzy language, making it easy for others to just brush it off or ignore it.
Exactly. You're consciously diluting the power of your own perception so you don't disturb anyone else's fragile reality too much.
Okay. Self-editing, lowering the voltage. What's the third?
The third, and this one can be really damaging internally, is learning to just withhold insight altogether. You see the pattern, you understand the dynamic, maybe the toxic relationship, the flaw in the system, the iceberg ahead.
But you say nothing.
You choose not to articulate it because you know deep down that clarity would instantly make you an outsider. Or worse, maybe it would make you responsible for fixing the problem you pointed out.
So the core of this compromise is trading your internal alignment, what you really see and think, for external security, for belonging. What does that do to a person, that internal split?
Well, the source calls this compromise trading honesty for proximity one of the most tragic human compromises. That's strong language.
Yes.
Because it's fundamentally a self-inflicted wound. You're swapping genuine internal coherence for an illusion of comfort and belonging. You're sacrificing your integrity for connection. You choose the consensus over yourself.
So you might still be in the group, physically.
But internally, you're fragmented. You're living with this constant low-grade hum of self-betrayal because you're consistently denying your own perception of reality just to fit in.
Okay, if that compromise, that fragmentation is the low point, the tragic part, then the response to that pain, the turning point, must be the shift away from needing the tribe's approval towards trusting your own judgment. This is what the sources call the awakening, right?
Exactly. The awakening is described as this rupture in the illusion. It often starts with a key moment of insight, a critical realization about why you're facing social rejection or discomfort when you speak clearly.
What's the realization?
It's the moment you stop feeling confused or hurt by people's negative reactions and instead understand, with sudden, sharp clarity, your clarity threatens the illusion they rely on.
That reframes everything. It stops being, what's wrong with me? Or, why don't they like me?
Right. It becomes, my perception is a threat to their stability, or I'm accidentally exposing the mechanics of their comfort zone. The rejection stops feeling personal and starts feeling structural.
It's not about your character flaws. It's about the function of your perception in that social system.
Precisely. And that realization is incredibly powerful because it neutralizes the emotional sting of that isolation tax we talked about. The source actually connects this kind of philosophical shift across different thinkers.
Yeah, you mentioned Alan Watts again. He calls this waking from the dream.
He does. Watts used that phrase beautifully to describe realizing that so much of what society treats as solid reality, the rigid lines between me and you, the endless chase for external validation, status, stuff, it's largely a collective agreement, a shared fantasy, really, built for comfort and managing interactions.
So waking up is seeing the matrix, basically, seeing the consensus for what it is, a useful, maybe, but ultimately constructed reality.
That's a good way to put it. And then Carl Jung, his term for a related process is individuation.
Individuation. What does that mean in this context?
For Jung, individuation is this lifelong psychological journey of becoming a whole, distinct individual, becoming differentiated from the collective soup, the psychology of your culture, your family, your social group. It's about integrating all parts of yourself, conscious and unconscious, moving beyond just the functional persona and becoming truly individual, as in indivisible, not fragmented, aligned with your own truth.
Okay, so this awakening, this move towards individuation, the sources use this to challenge how we usually define adulthood. It's not just about paying bills or having responsibilities.
No, it's much deeper. This marks the start of true psychological adulthood.
We should spend a moment here because that's a pretty radical redefinition.
Yeah.
If conventional adulthood is external job, mortgage, taxes, what does internal psychological adulthood look like?
Well, the source says it begins when you stop doing something crucial. You stop outsourcing your perception to the tribe. You stop relying on the collective consensus to tell you what's real or true.
Outsourcing perception.
Yeah.
What does that look like day to day? Because that sounds like something we probably do unconsciously all the time.
Oh, it's incredibly pervasive. It's waiting for the news anchor to tell you how to feel about a complex global event. It's scrolling your social media feed to see if your gut reaction to a movie or a song is the right one.
Checking if other people agree before you trust your own take.
Exactly. It's waiting for your political party or your favorite influencer to give you the talking points before you form an opinion. It's that constant, often unconscious habit of looking outside yourself for validation of your internal reality.
So psychological adulthood means taking that power back, which leads to the second pillar, right? Trusting your own judgment over the collective consensus.
This is where the rubber really meets the road. It's the moment of maximum risk, potentially, because it means even if everyone around you, the whole tribe, the whole internet, the whole culture believes X is true, if your own clear internal perception, your judgment, tells you why, you have to prioritize why.
That takes immense courage. You risk being wrong, alone, maybe even ridiculed.
Huge courage. But the sovereign person, the psychologically adult person, understands that the only validation that ultimately sticks, the only one that brings real peace, comes from that internal alignment, not from the crowd's approval.
Which then requires the third pillar, prioritizing truth over acceptance. This feels like directly undoing that tragic trade-off we talked about earlier. Choosing integrity over just fitting in.
Yes, completely. This internal shift, these three pillars together, marks the birth of sovereignty. Psychological sovereignty. Clarity stops being something you pursue for social advantage or just intellectual curiosity.
It becomes.
It's existential. It becomes fundamental to your being. The individual no longer needs the collective to stabilize their sense of reality because they've learned to stabilize it from within.
So sovereignty isn't about ruling others, it's about ruling yourself internally. It's a psychological state, not a political one.
Exactly.
How does this change why someone speaks the truth? If they're sovereign, what's their motivation now? It can't be to win friends or influence people if they've accepted the isolation tax.
Their motivation flipped entirely. They speak truth, not to gain acceptance. They've made their peace with the social cost of clarity. They speak truth primarily to avoid betraying themselves.
It becomes about internal integrity.
Completely. The driving force shifts from seeking an external reward, belonging, to avoiding an internal harm. Self-fragmentation, self-betrayal. They become their own primary audience, their own judge. And lying to that judge, betraying their own perception, that becomes the ultimate offense.
So they stick to the truth because the internal price of self-deception is now higher than the external price of potential isolation.
You got it. That's the core of sovereignty as described here.
Okay, so this shift toward sovereignty, toward prioritizing internal truth, it sounds liberating, powerful, but it still has that immediate real-world consequence. The social isolation we keep coming back to. The source is upfront about this, right? Clarity isolates. We have to acknowledge that initial sting.
Absolutely. We have to be realistic about it. The clearer your vision becomes, the more you see the narratives, the contradictions, the defenses playing out in the people around you. And the more accurately you perceive reality, well, the fewer people you can genuinely share that perception with.
Why? Because most people are still invested in it.
In their protective illusions, their comfortable stories, their emotional narratives that shield old wounds. It creates a fundamental incompatibility.
It's almost functional. If your truth pulls the rug out from under someone's coping mechanism, their narrative.
They have two choices. Either undertake that difficult transformation you mentioned earlier, dismantle their story, or distance themselves from you, the source of the uncomfortable clarity.
And distance is usually the easier path.
It's often the path of least resistance, yes.
Huh?
It creates this friction zone. Imagine one person operating in what feels like bright, high-definition truth, and someone else trying to maintain a soft, low-lit, comfortable shadow. Those two people can't really occupy the same intimate social space for long without discomfort.
The bright light reveals too much. It forces the other person to either step into it or retreat further into the shadows.
Precisely. But here's where the profound psychological shift happens. This is the turning point for the individual on this path. The cost of clarity, that isolation, it gets entirely reframed. For the sovereign individual, solitude stops feeling like suffering. It transforms. It becomes sanctuary.
Sanctuary.
A safe place.
Exactly. This reframing is presented as the ultimate payoff for having endured the initial loneliness, the isolation tax. Solitude becomes a necessary refuge. It's the only place, perhaps, where their truth can fully breathe, where it doesn't have to be edited down or have its voltage lowered or be apologized for.
It's a space where you no longer have to shrink yourself to fit into other people's comfort zones.
Yes. That constant pressure to make yourself smaller, less intense, less perceptive, just so others feel secure around you, that dissolves in solitude. You can just be with your perception.
And the source says something happens in that sanctuary, in exchange.
Yeah. An essential psychological trade occurs. It replaces the old need for social approval. The source calls it the swap meet. Self-respect replaces social approval.
So you trade the temporary high of being liked or accepted.
Which is always conditional, always requires performance.
For the steady, internal feeling of knowing you're aligned with yourself, with your own perception.
Exactly. It's durable, internally generated. Social approval is volatile. You have to keep earning it, keep performing. But self-respect, once you've earned it, through that commitment to your own truth, your integrity, it's much more stable, unshakable even.
It's like building your house on rock instead of sand.
That's a perfect analogy. The person needing approval is always chasing something outside themselves. The sovereign person has an internal compass, an internal measure, that doesn't need constant external feedback.
And this leads to a really powerful reframing of loneliness itself. The source redefines it. It's not just being without people.
No. It's redefined as the dissolution of self-betrayal.
Wow. Okay, unpack that. Dissolution of self-betrayal.
Think about that feeling of chronic loneliness. Sometimes people feel most alone when they're actually surrounded by others.
Yeah, that disconnect.
Often that stems from constantly compromising your core self to maintain those connections. You feel alone with people because the you that's present isn't the real you. It's the edited, voltage-lowered, insight-withholding version.
The persona.
Exactly. So the sovereign person comes to realize that the quiet pain of that constant self-betrayal is actually far worse than the literal silence of being physically alone. Once they stop lying to themselves to belong, once their inner reality and their outer expression start to align,
Solitude stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like peace.
peace, wholeness, the aching feeling of being alone in a crowd is replaced by the solid feeling of being with yourself authentically.
Okay, so that peace, that self-respect found in solitude.
Mm.
That brings us to the peak of this journey, doesn't it? The ultimate outcome. An internal definition of freedom. Self-belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And the source offers a definition of freedom that's really different from how we usually think about it, like political liberty or just doing whatever you want.
It's a total inversion, really. It flips the focus from external action to internal state. The source gives this incredibly powerful definition, contrasting it sharply with just, external license. Freedom is not doing what you want. Freedom is thinking what is true without needing permission.
Wow. Let that sink in. Freedom is thinking what is true without needing permission. That's breathtaking. It puts freedom entirely inside your own head, in your perception.
Exactly. The ability to act freely is secondary to the psychological ability to perceive freely without needing censorship or validation from outside.
So the deepest form of slavery isn't physical chains. It's needing someone else. The collective, the government, the experts, your friends, to tell you if your own thoughts, your own perceptions of reality are valid or okay.
That's the implication. If you constantly have to check, is it okay for me to think this? Does the group approve of this perception? Then you aren't truly free, no matter how much external liberty you seem to have.
You could be, I don't know, locked in a room, but still be completely sovereign and free inside just by holding on to your clear perception of your situation without needing the jailer's okay to see it that way.
Absolutely. It establishes this internal psychological boundary. And when you achieve that internal freedom, the ability to think what you perceive as true without needing that external stamp of approval, the world loses its main levers of control over you.
Because the world's primary tools to manipulate us are things like rejection, disapproval, shame, social exclusion.
Right. And all of those tools rely on our deep-seated need for belonging and acceptance. They only work if we care desperately about that external validation.
But if you're sovereign,
If you're no longer dependent on others to validate your clarity, those tools become, well, kind of toothless. If disapproval doesn't shake your core sense of self, it loses its power. If rejection is just seen as confirmation that your clarity is indeed isolating rather than proof that you're flawed, it stops being so painful. You've effectively decoupled your psychological well-being from external opinion.
and that decoupling, that internal freedom, leads to the ultimate reward, maybe. The source calls it belonging with yourself.
Yes. This feels like the true resolution of that tragic trade-off. You might lose the easy proximity of the tribe that relies on illusion, but you gain this incredibly stable, unshakable relationship with your own truth, your own perception.
It's companionship that doesn't require compromise.
Because it's rooted in self-acceptance, which comes from radical self-knowledge. You become the one person who fundamentally cannot reject you because you are aligned with yourself.
And that self-belonging, that sovereignty, allows for the final declaration, the action that really defines this freedom, summing up the whole path from seeking comfort to embracing clarity. You become someone who will sit alone rather than betray your own perception.
That sentence really encapsulates the whole thing, doesn't it? It's the thesis statement for psychological adulthood. It's the definition of non-negotiable integrity. The sovereign individual reaches a point where the social cost of solitude, even extreme solitude, is preferable to the internal cost, the soul corrosion, of lying to oneself just to have company.
They choose truth as their primary companion.
Recognizing that any relationship, any belonging built on a foundation of self-betrayal isn't real connection anyway. It's just a deeper, more insidious kind of loneliness. Hashtag outro. So we've really traced a powerful, maybe challenging psychological map today, starting in that comfortable realm of illusion, driven by the need to protect the persona, that mask shielding our identity, our emotional stories.
Right. And we saw that tragic trade-off where, for many, clarity gets sacrificed for proximity. People engage in self-editing, self-betrayal, just to maintain that sense of belonging.
But then, crucially, there's the path out, that awakening. Recognizing rejection differently, seeing it as structural, not personal, that leads towards psychological adulthood, towards sovereignty, where your own internal judgment finally outweighs the pull of the collective consensus.
And that culminates in this radical reframing. Solitude isn't suffering anymore, it's sanctuary. And freedom isn't just doing what you want, it's thinking what's true without needing anyone's permission.
The core choice remains really stark based on this material: truth and illusion. They can't really coexist peacefully within one person long term. To become sovereign, you ultimately have to choose. And choosing clarity means consciously deciding to step outside the comfortable collective dream.
And that whole mechanism of illusion back in Section 1, it was all about protecting two key things: our identity narrative and our emotional narratives.
Exactly. So for you, listening to this deep dive, maybe the place to start reflecting, the final thought we want to leave you with, builds directly on that. Take a moment and ask yourself honestly, what's one deeply held emotional narrative you rely on? A story about your past, maybe, or your abilities, or how relationships work. A story that, if you allowed objective truth to really dismantle it, would fundamentally change how you see yourself.
If you can pinpoint that story, the one you feel most protective of, the one you least want challenged.
You've likely found the boundary line, the edge between your current comfort zone and the clarity that might be waiting just beyond it.
A powerful place to reflect. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to The Debate. Our source material today brings into sharp focus one of the most, agonizing tensions in human psychology, this fundamental conflict between the pursuit of personal clarity, truth, and genuine psychological sovereignty versus the profound, almost evolutionary imperative for comfort, illusion, and maybe above all, social belonging. The text's core thesis, and it's quite uncompromising, is that these two objectives are fundamentally, zero-sum.
Indeed. And that forces us really to address a crucial philosophical and psychological question that stems directly from that premise. If we accept, even provisionally, that prioritizing truth inevitably entails some degree of isolation, does the ultimate path to what the text calls psychological adulthood and genuine internal sovereignty necessarily demand, the radical rejection of social connection? Defining solitude effectively as the non-negotiable sanctuary?
Exactly. And I will be arguing today that radical clarity, the kind achieved by consciously choosing truth over, let's say, proximity or comfort, is the non-negotiable standard for psychological freedom. The cost of belonging, which the text frames as self-betrayal, that cost is always too high for true maturity.
And I, on the other hand, will argue that while clarity is absolutely essential, no question there, this specific framework of sovereignty as presented dangerously oversimplifies human maturity. It seems to dismiss the necessary and, I'd argue, functional role of social identity and interdependence, creating an isolating standard that might be both unsustainable and, frankly, incomplete.
Okay, the source material I find compelling precisely because it offers a clear mechanism for achieving this freedom. It suggests there's a pivotal internal turning point, right, where one stops outsourcing perception to the tribe, as it puts it, and places truth above the need for acceptance. This specific shift is framed as the birth of sovereignty. And, we see echoes of this concept in deeper psychological thought. When Alan Watts talks about waking from the dream, or when Jung discusses individuation, they're describing something very similar, this radical internal separation. Individuation in Jungian terms is essentially this lifelong process of becoming a unified, conscious individual, separate, distinct from the collective psychology. So the text argues adulthood isn't achieved through external markers, job, family, whatever, but when one trusts their own judgment implicitly, even against collective consensus. And the ultimate freedom?
It's defined simply as thinking what is true without needing permission. That kind of internal authority, it suggests, is only possible when the self is fully detached from the tyranny of the group narrative.
Right. I come at it from a slightly different angle, though. The text beautifully, even painfully, articulates the price of truth, yes. Yet its framing, I think, risks defining necessary social compromise merely as a tragic human compromise. That feels a bit dismissive. My issue is that the material seems to define belonging too reductively, seeing it only as a comfortable illusion. And this, I believe, creates an unsustainable, arguably unrealistic, standard for psychological maturity. We have to acknowledge, don't we, that the self is social. It exists, it defines itself in relationship to others. Now, yes, Jung described the persona, that social mask we all wear to some extent, as psychological armor, but importantly, he also saw it as necessary. That armor, while a mask, is often essential for maintaining one's functional place in society, for navigating complex social reality effectively. Rejecting the persona entirely, or maybe more commonly, having it constantly threatened by a kind of radical truth-telling. Well, the text itself says this causes an individual to feel existentially endangered, and that intense, destabilizing psychological state seems to compromise stability and coherence far more than it confirms maturity.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the functional necessity of that social structure. But I would argue that this perceived necessity is the central trap. The text seems to suggest that the immediate defensive reaction you described, feeling existentially endangered when the persona is challenged, is precisely the evidence that the social self has become utterly confused with the true self. We're not really debating the utility of the mask in certain contexts. We're debating the profound psychological harm of believing the mask is your actual face.
But let's delve into that function more deeply. The necessity and function of the social self, the persona, within a structured society. You're framing it primarily as a barrier to truth. I'm arguing it's a required tool for, functional living. If one's identity coherence is threatened, the social defensive reactions the text describes, labeling the truth teller too serious or intense or whatever, these aren't solely based on, let's say, emotional cowardice. They arguably stem from a fundamental mechanism that ensures survival by maintaining a functional identity within a specialized group. I mean, just consider modern life. The specialized personas we adopt, our professional identity, our parental identity, and so on. These are essential for executing complex tasks and collaborations. The text, I feel, sometimes seems to conflate the mask of functional identity with the essential human need for social structure and belonging. So, threatening that mask doesn't automatically produce psychological freedom. It could actually produce psychological liability, maybe leading to functional paranoia or crippling withdrawal.
I have to fundamentally disagree with that framing, because it seems to prioritize social functioning over internal integrity. The source material, as I read it, highlights that the constant self-editing, the withholding of insight that's often required to maintain proximity to the tribe, that is the true psychological damage. That's the self-betrayal. The cost of clarity, being labeled intense, abrasive, maybe negative, it's argued this isn't a rational consequence of being truthful, it's a defense mechanism. It's designed to protect an emotional narrative, one that guarantees comfort and acceptance within the group. So if you are constantly shrinking your perception, your truth, to fit the collective comfort zone, you are in effect prioritizing the illusion of safety over internal truth. And the text argues quite strongly that this self-betrayal is the fundamental constraint on reaching psychological maturity. You might be functionally successful, yes, but psychologically, you remain subservient.
But the material itself suggests, doesn't it, that the person prioritizing this kind of sovereignty becomes isolated. We absolutely have to address the consequences of that isolation. If the cost of clarity is, potentially, social expulsion, how sustainable is that model of psychological adulthood? We're not just talking about someone quietly acknowledging internal contradictions. The text seems to imply actively pointing out contradictions to others, which, let's be honest, is often the catalyst for social rejection. So if sovereignty is inherently isolating, doesn't that risk making it an inherently unstable position, prone perhaps to untested private delusions, simply replacing the collective ones?
Well, that brings us directly to the asserted trade-off, doesn't it? Belonging versus truth. And I would absolutely defend the text's core assertion here, that truth and illusion cannot coexist. The prioritization of belonging over truth is indeed framed as the root of human tragedy precisely because it poisons internal autonomy. Sovereignty in this view is gained only when rejection, disapproval, manipulation, all those social pressures, lose their coercive power over you. And that liberation, the text argues, happens precisely when belonging with yourself, that sense of internal alignment, supersedes the desperate need for external social approval.
See, I find that framing problematic because it seems to demand an unnecessary and potentially damaging trade-off. Can one truly achieve psychological clarity without also navigating the complex reality of interdependence? If the ultimate goal is internal integrity, why must the primary consequence be radical isolation, which the text then sort of rebrands, arguing that solitude becomes sanctuary? And this reframes loneliness. Now, while that sounds potentially restorative, it also risks pathologizing the fundamental human requirement for connection. Connection isn't merely comfort. It's also a crucial means of reality testing, isn't it? It's the sovereign adult must become someone who sees reality so precisely that they have, quote, fewer people you can share it with. Aren't we potentially just exchanging one form of existential danger, the loss of self to the group, for another? A radical disconnection from shared reality that could, theoretically, lead to crippling neurosis or alienation.
I understand the fear of disconnection, believe me. But the text argues quite persuasively, I think, that the isolation isn't a punishment inflicted by others. It's fundamentally an internal choice, one made out of self-respect. When you cease shrinking yourself to fit others' narratives, you are choosing internal peace, regardless of the social vacuum it might temporarily create. The isolation is simply the natural consequence of escaping the collective illusion. You seem to be focusing quite heavily on the external loss, the loss of company, while the text defines the internal gain, which is the removal of constant self-betrayal, as the definitive mark of freedom. The true sanctuary isn't necessarily solitude itself, but the cessation of that painful internal conflict.
Yet, surely true maturity must integrate complexity, not radically separate itself from it. Let's reconsider the definition of psychological adulthood and freedom. The text implies, quite strongly, that adulthood begins only when one stops outsourcing perception. Now, while intellectual autonomy is clearly crucial, I would argue that maturity involves the ability to perhaps use the persona functionally, when needed, while retaining absolute internal clarity about one's true self and perceptions. The functional difference here seems key. Does the sovereign individual need to constantly point out contradictions, practically guaranteeing social expulsion? Or can they possess that clarity internally while still engaging, skillfully, with the necessary complexity and sometimes, yes, the necessary illusions of the social world?
But that proposed middle ground you describe, the functional use of the persona coupled with internal clarity, that sounds suspiciously like the sophisticated self-editing the text suggests is ultimately impossible if one genuinely prioritizes truth above all else. If you possess radical clarity, and yet you consciously choose to withhold it, or you phrase it in a way that's palatable purely to maintain proximity, isn't that still a betrayal of your own perception? It effectively maintains the comfort of the illusion for others, thereby reinforcing the very system of validation you supposedly claim to have escaped internally.
But why must the expression of truth be so consistently volatile that it inevitably leads to expulsion? That's where I think the framework demands an almost unnecessary standard of purity, or perhaps confrontation. True freedom for me isn't just the ability to sit alone. It's the internal autonomy to navigate the incredible complexity of interdependence without losing your core self in the process. If you find yourself constantly seeking confrontation by pointing out every contradiction, you risk trading the collective illusion for a kind of posture of antagonistic sovereignty, which feels quite far from genuine maturity. Maturity, in my view, might actually be the capacity to hold two difficult truths simultaneously: the functional necessity at times of social identity and the immutable clarity of the inner self.
I have to challenge whether that truly constitutes freedom, though. The text consistently defines freedom as internal autonomy. Becoming someone who, quote, will sit alone rather than betray your own perception is presented as the definitive goal. Why? Because it demonstrates that self-respect has finally replaced that desperate, almost primal craving for social validation. The very fear of the cost of clarity, losing status, losing friends, being disliked, shows that one is still operating within the approval system that the text identifies as the primary constraint on maturity. The moment you are genuinely free of needing that system, the isolation ceases to feel like a cost and becomes perhaps a liberation. The text suggests quite strongly that the emotional narrative of the group drives the rejection of truth precisely because the truth threatens their perceived identity, who they think they are. Escaping that threat is the definition of sovereignty offered.
I still find that standard potentially damaging to the human psyche in the long run. If the ultimate marker of psychological adulthood is the significant loss of connection, we really have to ask if the human nervous system, our very biology, is built to sustain that kind of permanent state of near-total self-reliance. While sovereignty is undoubtedly desirable, if achieving it requires such radical detachment, we risk creating a solitary, almost atomized model of maturity that feels profoundly anti-human and potentially unstable, regardless of the internal clarity it might generate. Perhaps adulthood should be defined less by retreat and more by the ability to navigate complexity and interdependence with integrity, not just withdraw from it into a self-chosen, albeit clear-sighted isolation.
Well, to summarize my position, I stand by the text's central, if challenging thesis. Psychological clarity and truth demand, perhaps necessitates, the dissolution of the comfortable illusion and the shedding of the overly identified with social persona. The isolation experience, therefore, isn't a tragedy, but the natural, maybe even liberating consequence of prioritizing self-respect over self-betrayal, leading directly to what the text argues is the only true form of psychological sovereignty.
And while I fully agree that internal truth is paramount, my analysis maintains that this particular framework significantly, perhaps dangerously, oversimplifies the essential social dimension of the self. By demanding that maturity be defined by this stark, radical choice between truth and belonging, it presents an extreme and, I suspect, often unsustainable model of adulthood that fails to fully account for the necessary functions and even the deep psychological needs of interdependence.
This exchange, I think, certainly illuminates the central and, yes, profound challenge presented by our source material. The need to really examine the severe costs, but also the potential ultimate rewards associated with prioritizing internal truth over external validation. It forces us all, I suppose, to confront the price of living authentically.
Absolutely. It leaves the listener ultimately with the heavy, perhaps defining task of weighing the price of sovereignty, including that potential for radical isolation, against the deep-seated psychological comfort of illusion and belonging, and deciding for themselves whether true adulthood really demands that these two powerful forces must remain forever mutually exclusive.